Hello, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to our session today, Secure Your Public Sites. Learn how to make your public sites a safe place to share information. So I'm briefly going to cover our safe harbor statement. Sometimes we do make forward-looking statements. We do this so that we can share our roadmap and vision with you. However, we do recommend that at the time of purchasing, you make purchasing decisions based on the product capabilities that are available at the time of purchase. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm Sneha Khade, Director of Engineering here at Salesforce. Alex, please can you introduce yourself?
My name is Alex Kaufman. I'm a Principal Software Engineer at Salesforce. Nelson?
Hi, my name is Nelson Wong. I'm a software architect here at Salesforce.
All right, so let's get started. So what are we covering today? Today we're going to talk about public sites and what you need to keep in mind when you configure your public sites and how you can make them secure. We will also go over some of the changes that we are making to the guest security platform. I recommend that you pay close attention to this because these are changes that will impact some of your public sites. So as a part of the agenda, we will talk about what is a Salesforce public site. We'll go into details on why would you want to create a Salesforce public site, or why would you want to expose your data publicly. We will then talk about how you can configure this guest profile to be more secure. After that, we will go into details on what are the access model for Salesforce users. We will also do a deep dive in guest sharing model and record ownership. Finally, we will talk about guest user visibility. At the end of all this, we have a demo that will cover all these different aspects of our platform, and it will show you when you create a public site what you should keep in mind so that your public site is secure and a safe place to share information for unauthenticated access. All right, so what is a Salesforce public site? So basically, Salesforce public sites, they allow you to broaden your audience. And how do they do this? They do this by allowing unauthenticated access. So what does this mean? Anybody on the internet can now access your public site without requiring to log in. So how would you create a public site? You can use force.com or site.com or the communities platform to create your public site. Now, whenever you create a public site, a unique guest profile is created for this public site. And hence, we'll go into more details around what is this guest profile and how you can make it secure. In addition to the guest profile, there are external profiles in your site. Now, these profiles, they determine what access, what content, data, or objects your external users have access to. Now, these are users that can actually log in to your sites. You all are familiar with the Trailblazer community that we have over here. When we all go to the Trailblazer community, we are all guest users. And hence, the guest profile determines what data, object, or entities you can see on the guest on this Trailblazer community as a guest user. Now, say you want to log in. So if you see the top right button, there's a login option. Once you log in, you're an external user on this site. So the external profiles start taking into account, which means whatever is defined on your external profile now gets applied when you're an external user on this site. So we spoke about what is a public site. Now, why would you want to create a public site, or why would you want to expose your data publicly? There are many reasons you might want to do this. For instance, you want to share your CRM data. For instance, you want to locate a dealer, make a donation, or make an appointment. In all these scenarios, you will be sharing your CRM data for public access. In other cases, you might want to share user information. For instance, viewing the leaderboard, or allowing other users to @mention users. In all these scenarios, you'd have to look into how you want to expose your user data for public access. And in other cases, you want to expose chatter. For example, public forums, public files, or even public groups. So in these cases, you will want to expose some of your chatter data. And hence, there are many scenarios you might want to expose some of this data, CRM user or chatter data, for your unauthenticated access. That is why it is very critical that you understand what is a guest profile and how can you configure this guest profile to be more secure. So let's go into details of that. What is a guest profile? Now, every time you create a community, Salesforce creates a guest user, a guest profile, and sharing mechanisms for this guest user. What does this mean? Say you have 3 sites in your org, site 1, site 2, site 3. For each of these sites, a unique user profile and user record is created. And hence, site 1 has guest user record 1 and guest user profile 1. Similarly, site 2 has guest user profile 2, guest user record 2, and so on. So now you can see there's a unique guest profile per site. So it's very important that you secure the guest profile. You look into configurations of the guest profile when you're thinking of a public site. So let's look into that. How can you make your guest profile to be more secure? Now, there are different aspects of the guest profile when you look at it. So how many of you here have looked at the guest profile page? Quite a few of you, OK. So there are different aspects that you need to focus on when you're configuring this guest profile. There are object settings. We ask you to review all the objects that your guest user has access to. It is very important that the guest user have access to no objects. Now, say your business use case requires you to provide access to certain objects. We do recommend that you give maximum read or create permission to these objects. Guest users should not have update, delete, view all data, modify all data for these objects. Now, once you've done with object permissions, the next step is field level security. Now that you've reviewed which objects your guest user need access to, check if the fields have the right access. So based on your use case, review all the fields that this guest user has access to and ensure that it has access to just the right amount of fields. Now you've done object settings, field level security. Another critical area of the guest profile is system permissions. We do recommend that you deselect any system permissions that you do not need for your use case. Another important part of the guest profile is the Visualforce page and Apex. So review all the whitelisted Visualforce pages for the guest user. Remove any pages that you think that your guest user should not have access to. Also, if you have Apex classes that do without sharing or bypass field level security or any object permissions, we do recommend that you keep these to a minimum. So right now we have covered what are public sites, why would you create a public site, what is this guest profile, and how you can configure the guest profile to be secure. Now we will move on to understand the access models for Salesforce users, and Alex is going to cover this section.
Thank you, Sneha. So can I get a show of hands of people who have configured object permissions, field permissions, or sharing before? All right, seems like a good mix. So if you have not configured object permissions, field permissions, or sharing, or you need a refresher, this section is for you. So in this section, I will be talking about the access model for Salesforce users. This will focus on internal users and external users, such as portal users and guest users. I would like to emphasize that in this section, this is talking about existing platform features. So Salesforce has a layered security model. That means that different data can be exposed to different users. The idea is that you want your users to see the least amount of data in order to do their job. This is the concept of least privilege. The first things you must configure in the Salesforce access model are object permissions and field permissions, and that can be done through permission sets and profiles. Object permissions control what objects your users can see. They grant create, read, edit, or delete access. As an example, an interviewer would have read access on a job posting and job application, but they would not have edit, delete, and create access. In addition, object permissions have sharing override settings, view all data, and modify all data. That allows all users to see the objects, and that overrides existing sharing rules and settings. After you have configured object permissions, you need to configure field permissions to control sensitive data fields. Going back to our interviewer example, we can say that an interviewer should not be able to see a salary field, but a recruiter and hiring manager can. Now that you have configured object permissions and field permissions, it is now time to configure sharing, which is record level access. The best way to understand sharing is this pyramid and to view it from bottom up as opening up access. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have our org-wide defaults. This is the default record level access. There are two types of org-wide defaults, one for internal users, one for external users. Next, we have the role hierarchy. This allows managers to see their subordinates' records. Next, we have sharing rules. This allows a group of users to see data they do not own or normally can see. And finally, we have the manual share. This allows a record owner to give read and edit access to a record. I'd like to point out that includes Apex sharing reasons as well. Now I will go over the guest sharing model and record ownership as it pertains to the Salesforce guest user security policy. So I would like you to all listen very carefully here, because on March 1st, 2020, Salesforce will have a new guest user security policy, which entails the following. 1, the external org-wide default for guest users will be decoupled, and it will always be private, because you do not want your guest users to have default access to records. Next, if your guest user must have access to records, you must create a guest user sharing rule, which allows at most read access. Guest users should not own records, because that's insecure. Therefore, you should utilize the default owner change feature. And finally, guest users should have at most create and read access. Now I will go into a deep dive of all the things I've explained previously. So let's start with the guest user sharing model. Prior to Winter 20, the default external access referred to portal users and guest users. This is insecure because that means if you gave portal users read-only access, you would also give guest users read-only access to your data. Therefore, in Winter 20, we introduced an admin org pref called Secure Guest User Record Access. When this is enabled, it will decouple the org-wide defaults of the portal users and guest users so that default external access only refers to the portal users, and guest users will have private org-wide defaults. As part of enabling that org pref, we have also removed guest users from public groups, queues, and manual shares. The purpose of that is we do not want admins to inadvertently share data to guest users. If you try to create a public group, you will see that the guest user will no longer be part of the public group. If you try to create a queue, the guest user will not show up in the users list, so they won't be a member of the queue. And finally, if you click the manual sharing button on the record detail page, you will notice that the guest user will not be able to be part of a manual share. Now that the org-wide defaults are private and we need to give access to data for guest users, we now need to see what we can do for sharing. So to understand that, let us look back at the sharing pyramid. So we know the org-wide default for guest users is now private. Guest users are not part of role hierarchies. As stated previously, they will not be part of manual sharing, which implies we need a new type of sharing rule, which is why we created the guest user sharing rule. The purpose of the guest user sharing rule is to make it very clear to the admin that they are sharing data to a guest user. The guest user sharing rule grants at most read access. Now let's go into how to configure a guest user sharing rule. So what you would do is you would go to the sharing settings page, find the rule on the object you would like to create the guest user sharing rule, and click New. So the first thing to note is you must select guest user access based on criteria. That indicates you will be creating a guest user sharing rule. Next, you would select the criteria for the guest user sharing rule. This is similar to how you create criteria-based sharing rules today. Next, you would select the profile to indicate that this guest sharing rule is for that guest user. Finally, you need to select the level of access, and per Salesforce guest user security policy, it must be read access. Now we can go over some use cases of the guest sharing rule. So let's assume you have a volunteer app and you want to basically make a modification to the shift. So you need to note that the guest user has private org-wide defaults, and you can use guest sharing rules to grant at most read access. This implies you can actually not modify the data as a guest user. Therefore, you must either authenticate into Salesforce to modify the data, or you need to create a custom object and have Apex code capture those changes. Another use case would be if a guest user wants to view partner accounts in a partner marketplace and find partner accounts closest to them. Again, the guest user has private org-wide default, and you can only get access through a guest user sharing rule, which grants at most read access. Therefore, the guest user needs to get read access on the account. Therefore, you create a guest user sharing rule on account and grant read access. Okay, now Nelson will be talking about creating data anonymously.
Thank you, Alex. So now let's talk about creating data anonymously. Oftentimes, you might want to allow your users to create data anonymously on your sites. For example, you have a shopping site where you want users to be able to create a shopping cart and check out as guests. Or you want your guest users to be able to go to your site and request for services without having to create an account and log in. So in those cases, to configure this data access, you can use the guest user profile because, like we mentioned, the guest user represents all anonymous users. But you want to be careful when you configure this user profile because you don't want to grant more access than needed to your data for anonymous users. So to allow the guest user to create data on your site, you want to grant the create access to your data objects. And also, you want to configure the field level access to configure only the fields that you want the guest user to be able to create data for to be accessible to the guest user. So once this data access has been configured, you can use the Salesforce standard components, flows, or your custom built UI to expose this feature to your sites. Now, once this anonymous data is created, who gets to own it? Generally, we don't want the guest user to be the owner of this data because that means all anonymous users will have full sharing access to all this data. And that's usually not what we want. So the best practice is to use assignment rules, process builder, or triggers to assign the ownership to this anonymous data. And also, we have a new feature in Winter 20 called Guest Record Default Owner that will automatically reassign the ownership to this data for you. And this will also be enforced in Spring 20, so this feature will be always on. Now, what if the guest user wants to go back to view or update this data that's created by them? For example, the guest user may want to go back to their order to modify or cancel it, or add items to it. Or the guest user may want to go back to the services they requested and modify and cancel it. In these cases, again, we don't want to share the data to all anonymous users, right? So we don't want to grant sharing access or update, delete object permissions to the guest user. And for this special case, instead, we want to generate a secure access token. This can be an encrypted record ID, for example. And in the example of shopping cart, once the order is placed by the guest user, you can send an email to the guest user. And in that email, it will contain a link, a URL link, to go back and edit, update, or cancel this order. And this link can contain this access token in it. So with this access token, you can grant elevated access to the user to do update and delete on this data using, for example, access without sharing, only for this kind of special actions. So that's creating data anonymously. Now let's take a look at user visibility. There may be different reasons you want users on your site to be able to see other users. For example, you want to show a discussion feed on your site so that users can see discussions or questions asked by other users. Or you may want to show like a leaderboard on your site to show the top users on your site. So generally, for these use cases, you can use sharing rules to share user records to other users. And specifically for communities, we have this concept of community user visibility, which controls whether the users in the community can see other users. And in Winter 20, we also introduced a new concept called guest user visibility, which controls whether the guest user, the anonymous users, can see users in that community. And these two features combined allows you to do fine-grained control of what users can see other users in your community. So these features can be configured on the org level or per community level. So on the left-hand side, you can see in the sharing settings page, on the org level, we have this community user visibility feature. When you enable it, it allows all users in all communities in your org to be able to see other users. And on the right-hand side, on the community level, we also have two options to control whether community users in that particular community can see other users, or the guest user in that community can see other users in the community. So we have talked a lot about these security features. I'm sure everybody wants to see a demo, right? So now we're going to do a demo to show how all these security features can be applied to a public site to allow secure sharing of your data on the site. So let me switch to demo. Here, what you're seeing is a website for Capricorn Industrial Portal. Capricorn is a manufacturer of coffee machines. So they sell coffee machines to cafes and other companies. And they created this portal site for their customers to connect and see each other's questions and discussions and ask questions themselves, or see the latest information about their products. And I've built a few pages to showcase how we can share the data securely. And now I'm going to go through these pages and a few examples. First, let's go into the products page. I'm going to click on our products. So this page is to show the coffee maker products. But right now, as you can see, there's no information yet, because I haven't granted the data access to the guest user for the coffee maker product object, which I created as a custom object. So what I'll need to do is to go back into the org and go to the guest user profile, as we talked about. And the guest user profile for this site, as you can see, there's a lot of different settings and permissions you can configure, including the field level security and user settings and permissions and object permissions. So now let's go ahead and grant access to the coffee maker product object to the guest user. I'm going to click Edit. And I'll go to the coffee maker product object. So here, I'll check read. So I want the guest user to be able to read and view data records in this object. I don't want them to be able to do anything else on this object. So I'm going to only check read, and I'm going to save it. And as we mentioned, we have a multi-layered security model, which means granting the object permission is not enough for the user to see the records. We also need to go and share the actual records I want this user to be able to see. So now I'll need to go into the sharing settings page. So here's the sharing settings page. And the sharing by default, as we mentioned, is always going to be private for the guest user. So that means I'll need to explicitly create a sharing rule to share these records to the guest user. So here I'm going to click New to create a new sharing rule. I'm going to call it guest sharing. I'm going to select the new sharing rule type for guest user sharing. And I can define the criteria I want to share records to the guest user. For example, I only want the active products to be viewable by the guest user, so that any products that are discontinued or in development will not be accessible by the guest user. I'm also going to select the guest user for the Capricorn industry website. And the access level is always going to be read-only. Now I'm going to save it. So the sharing rules are going to take a few moments to recalculate. And let's see if it's done yet. So now I'm going to go back to the products page and hit refresh. So as you can see, after granting the data access, I'll be able to see the products on this page that I've built. So that's how you securely share the records, the exact records you want the guest user to have read access to on your sites. So the second example I want to show is the discussions page. So discussions page is where I want to show the community discussions to users, including guest users. So there's the link, and I already have the page open. Again, I don't see any data here yet, because the community discussions page has the users making posts and questions on the feed, and they belong to the users that make the posts. So the user, the guest user, will have to have visibility to all these users to be able to see their posts. So what I need to do is to grant visibility to other users for the guest user in this community. I'm going to go into the community's preferences page and check this option to let guest users to see other users in the community and save it. Once I've done that, let's go back and refresh the page. So now I can start seeing discussions and questions by other users in the same community. So that's how you share data. Now let's take a look at the last example I want to show, which is to allow the guest user to create data on the site. So there are use cases, oftentimes you want guest users to create data, like for example, submitting a request for services. In this case, if the customer has a problem with their coffee makers, with their machines, and they want to schedule a service on your site, but you don't want the user to have to create an account and log in to be able to do that. So for this case, I have built this request service option. Now if I click on it, you see that it shows a flow UI for the user to enter information about the service request, like the name, address, and the model number, serial number of the product as such. And all this data is backed by a custom object called service request that I created. So again, I have to go back to the guest user profile to first grant access to this service request object to the guest user. So I'm going to click Edit on the guest user profile and find the service request object. But this time, I want to grant create access to the guest user so the guest user will be able to create service requests on your site. And read will also be checked automatically when you click Create. And I'm going to save it. And additionally, I also want to configure the field level access for the guest user because I don't want the guest user to be able to edit or create values for all the fields in this object. So let's go into field level security and look for the service request object and click Edit. So here, there's this status field. I want to keep it as internal use only so that I can track the status of this request. So I don't want the guest user to be able to edit or create values for it. So I'm gonna uncheck it for edit access and save it. So once I'm done with all this security configuration for this data object, now I can go ahead and create this service request as a guest user. I'm going to fill in some information, last name, maybe Dreamforce or something. Dreamforce 19. And next, I'm going to fill in some description for the problem I'm having with the coffee machine. Coffee is too hot, for example. And now the service request has been submitted. Now let's go back to the org to see this data that gets submitted to the org. So I'm going to go to the service request page and look at all the service requests. And the latest one submitted by Astro, I'm going to go into the details of it. And what I want you to see is that the owner of this record has been reassigned to Eric Ware. That's because I have already created a process in the process builder to automatically reassign the owner for security reasons for this anonymously created data. So now we have demonstrated a few examples on how to use the Salesforce security features to securely share data on your site and allow users to create data on your site. And now let's go back to the slides. So we have discussed the Salesforce security model and object permissions, field level security, sharing, etc., and how they can be applied to your public site to securely share data to external users and anonymous users. And we have also talked about how to grant users visibility to other users, as well as an example of how you can allow creation of data anonymously. So here are some links to resources where you can find more information on these security features and also the best practices on security for public sites in Salesforce. And with that, we want to thank you again for coming to our session. We're going to post the slides on the session page on the chatter feed. And also, if you have questions, you can come forward, and we'll try to answer them. Thank you.